Patrick or JP. I have many wake words I guess I have to listen for, and I've been called much worse. So just feel free to shout in my general direction, and I'll try to answer you. I am a principal program manager in the identity division with my partner, Christos. We work on helping developers use our platform and be successful in it. The breadth of the identity platform is our oyster, I suppose. And one of the things that we wanted to come and talk about was some new changes that we're seeing in our libraries to make consuming the identity service that much easier, especially if you're a .NET developer. And so that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to talk sort of about what it is and why it is the way it is, and then just go into some demos about what's it like to use this for a brand new application that you're building from scratch, and what's it like to try to port an old application over into it. So here you see Christos and I discussing the new Identity.Web as we normally do in the subway, just like everybody does when they're at work, obviously, as they talk to their friends about new hot libraries that they're seeing. The first thing, and this audience probably doesn't need to worry too much about why they should use an external identity provider, but it's still an important sort of topic is, well, why shouldn't I just do this myself? Well, there are lots of reasons why you shouldn't do it on your own. Many of these reasons are popping up on the screen right now, is that generally speaking, people are not terribly good, developers are not terribly good at maintaining databases full of sensitive user information. And so it tends to be a good idea to let somebody else deal with it. Let somebody else handle the trouble of, how do I reset my users' passwords? How do I store them securely? How do I make sure that I'm compliant with all the sorts of different policies that go around handling that user information? And so if you're a developer, that's all extra work for you, right? And instead, it's much easier to punt that down the street, to delegate that off to somebody else for a fairly reasonable fee, and let them deal with it on their own. So of course you see these numbers here over almost 10 billion accounts that have been hacked or released to the internet in some form or fashion. That comes from haveibeenpwned.com, and that was as of last December. So the number's probably even higher by now. But one of the things to keep in mind is there are not that many developers who focus solely on identity. There are some, a lot of them work here, for example, in our division, but generally speaking, a developer in an enterprise or a commercial software developer, identity is a part of what they need to do, but it's not the end goal. The end goal is not to have a bunch of identity-related code to sign users in or to access APIs. The goal is to do some other sort of business task or to solve a business problem. And identity is one of the requirements, a foundational requirement to actually go and get there. And so what we hear over and over and over again is, I just want this to work. This is super complex, and there are all sorts of protocols that I need to worry about, and which ones are secure and which ones are not. And I don't know what a JWT is, and I don't know how a signature gets made, and I don't know what to do. And we hear this quite frequently. So the whole point of our new libraries is making it easier for us to sort of fall into the pit of success, to use a cliched term, of I just need to add authentication to my application. I just need to call an API, and I need to be confident that in doing that, I'm not going to be in the news one day, right? And so you'll notice here, of course, these people are looking at a map of Midwest, central United States, but they were able to delete so much code using Identity.Web that they felt like they needed to present it to their whole org. So here they are. And of course, even Bob can figure it out, right? The whole point of our library is to make it much easier to be successful. So identity for all developers is sort of a common theme, common thing you're going to hear from us. So today, if you're doing ASP.NET, and yesterday, if you're doing ASP.NET, and really back for quite a decent period of time, you sort of had these two really discrete experiences. One side was the ASP.NET configuration, be it ASP.NET Framework or ASP.NET Core or ON with ASP.NET, where you had to configure a sign-in operation or some sort of way to get your users to authenticate. And that was somewhat discrete from, well, I also need to get data from APIs. How do I get a token to go and do that, right? If I'm on-prem, this is all happening behind the scenes because I'm on a domain joined machine, and that domain joined machine has IIS, and it's running our app, and it's talking to, say, SQL Server or another API using a service account. And so if you're a developer, you never really had to worry about it. But once you move into the sort of new world of using external identity providers, and in particular Azure AD, suddenly all these protocols are sort of right in your face. And the identity community as a whole loves to have all of this really specific and esoteric vocabulary that's really hard to navigate if you're new, or really hard to navigate if you don't really care about it. You just need to sign users into your app. And so in ASP.NET, we had to sort of deal with the ASP.NET side of things, of the OpenID Connect middleware or the OAuth middleware, and that would get our users signed in. But then when we needed to get tokens to call downstream APIs, suddenly we had to use something different. We had to use ADAL or MSAL. And so by switching to those two, we ended up in a kind of a strange position where we had these two very discrete experiences of, I've got my OpenID Connect stuff that I've configured, but I need to hook into specific events in order to get MSAL configured or ADAL configured correctly. And it's super confusing. And especially if identity is not something you're doing and building with every day, it has a tendency to get even more confusing, because there are all sorts of different events that happen in the sort of overall life cycle of an OpenID or an OAuth request. And so that was very difficult. And we have noticed for years of the developers struggling with knowing exactly when to do the right things and which foot to put where at just the right time in order to make sure they had what they needed. The other side of that are the API developers themselves. API developers are driving most of the new apps that are being built. And we've got things like a React or Angular front end that's talking to a backend API. And now we need that backend API needs to support OAuth 2 tokens, or it needs to know the user's authorized to use that service. And then we get into the discussion around scopes and token validation and what does a valid token mean? And so that was something you use the JWT bearer middleware for, which was, again, somewhat of a bifurcated experience. We had the JWT bearer middleware for Web API and ASP.NET, but we also, if you needed a token to call another service, which is of course fairly common, now you also had to go and configure MSAL on your own. So the Identity.Web library aims to essentially abstract all that away. All of the complexity of configuration of which thing goes where at which point, and I have to copy 400 lines out of a doc or a sample in order to make this work. The Identity.Web library aims to do the majority of that work for you with some tasteful defaults, while still managing to give you enough extensibility points and enough ejection points to do more complex work as you need to, right? One of the big ones here is the fact that all of the OpenID Connect middleware that runs ASP.NET, all of that's configured for you. All of the UI bits that you need for redirecting a user over to sign in, for receiving those tokens when they come back, all of that's wired up for you automatically. The audience validator is probably one of the coolest or one of the neatest parts of this library. Is if we look at the OpenID Connect configuration data that comes out of Azure AD, if you're not using a tenanted URL, if you're not using an Azure AD specific URL, you end up in a position where you have to validate that the audience of your token is correct, but you don't necessarily know which audience, or you don't necessarily know which tenant your user may be coming from. And so now there's an audience validator that's included to make sure that you're getting an issuer validator to make sure you're getting the right, a proper sort of Microsoft issuer and audience for the token that you're receiving. All of the MSAL configurations handled for you. So instead of having to create new MSAL objects and manipulate them on your own, all of that's done for you and abstracted into a new API for using that. But all of the ASP.NET sort of fundamentals around like iDistributed cache, those are all still available. So instead of having to build your own MSAL cache or your own ADAL cache for storing tokens for further use or for later use, All that happens for you, and if you've configured a distributed cache, we will use that. It sort of automatically will pick that up for you. And then, of course, for API developers, it's very similar. So if we look at sort of the evolution of this library, right? So the first thing that you have to do when you're using ASP.NET is you have to configure all of this stuff. OpenID Connect, cookie, JWT bearer, account controllers, the views that run the front ends for those accounts. And today you have something called the Azure AD UI library. The Azure AD UI library is sort of a first pass at an attempt to make using Azure AD a little bit easier, but it uses the V1 endpoints, which of course that's been a big thing that's coming up, is it's using V1, and we want everybody to start moving to V2, especially with the deprecation of ADAL to MSAL on the horizon in just under 2 years. We want everybody to start using the V2 endpoints, and of course these libraries use the V1 ones. So these were wrapped up into this Azure AD UI library, but you still had to deal with MSAL separately. And so now we have Identity.Web to sort of come underneath the whole thing and give you a new sort of API surface to work with. The primitives are all still there. All of the sort of basics that you know and love and are familiar with today in ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core, they're all still there. They're just abstracted away from you so that you don't have to necessarily have 300 lines of code in your startup.cs in order to configure MSAL and get users signed into your app. So just to take a quick look at what that kind of looks like, things like this, add authentication, add Azure AD, have been replaced with things like add Microsoft.Identity.Web app authentication. Most of these are chained calls. So when we get to MSAL is when we see the big improvement. Here, you're responsible for creating an MSAL client and then handling authorization codes and handling token caching. Here, we give you one extra chained call to your add Microsoft Identity Web App authentication called enable token acquisition to call downstream API. And so now you've got, in your config, you have two objects or two things that you need to do. One is to enable sign-in, which is the first one, and the second one is I need MSAL with a token cache. Please go and create it for me. We haven't forgotten about API developers. They have the same new experience as well, where instead of having to configure all of the different pieces for getting MSAL tokens and for configuring an MSAL cache, instead, API developers get the same really quick and easy experience of, I just need to add web API authentication and enable token acquisition to call another API. So it's the intention is for it to be extremely easy to use and to not require you as the developer to have any sort of ultra deep understanding of protocols, of tokens specifically, of what it takes to sort of enable OAuth and OpenID Connect on an app. It doesn't require you to have a whole lot of really deep knowledge in it. We want you to understand it enough to configure it and to sort of know what's happening, but not have to be a really deep expert to feel confident that your app is going to be secure. So Christos is going to show us what that looks like when building a net new application in .NET today. The library itself is still in preview. It should be coming out into GA relatively soon. And so he's going to step through what it looks like to add this to a new app. So Christos, I'll let you take it away.
Exactly. Thank you for the intro. And I'm probably going to blow your minds today because it did blow my mind the first time I actually had to use the library. And fun fact is probably I was the first one to download the NuGet package when it came out. So very fresh bits back in early June or late June, early July. So the library has been out there for a while now. We have 0.4 version running, and we're heading fast for our GA, which is coming very, very soon. But we do have support for the preview bits. And if you're looking to get started, there's a GitHub repo. If you search for Microsoft.Identity.Web, you land here. It contains all the documentation as well. So you can start with conceptual documentation and then start drilling into the advanced topics. We also have a lot of samples that cover not just the simple scenarios of I want to just authenticate a user, which is great, but also authenticating users and calling into Graph, or authenticating users and calling other APIs, API to API on behalf flows and what have you. So make sure you check out the samples and start working through there. What I have here in front of us is a very simple app. So it's a file new project. And I did not add any authentication out of the box because the templates have not made it into the Visual Studio yet. The preview bits are already in place, so it will be landing very, very soon. In fact, they might be announcing that at Ignite. I don't know exact the timing, but even so, the CLI and the Visual Studio templates will be updated very, very soon. If you want to get started with templates today and you want to do a file new project, there are actually templates. What about template? Maybe here. And you can download the templates. So if you want to do file new project through the CLI, it allows you to go and quickly create a project. But what I want to focus today is the code. There are three things that you need to do three things that you need to do to work with the new authentication. The first thing is go into your project. If I open that one, just reference the Microsoft.Identity.Web library and the UI if you're creating a front end or a user kind of interface. And then inside your startup, if you're working with .NET Core, you just come in here. You need to reference the library, and it's a one-liner. It's literally a one-line configuration that you need to do to implement the authentication in your app. You pass the configuration, so we do have defaults. So as long as your app settings have an Azure AD with the appropriate information here, then the startup will pick it up and will run. And then you can do all the customizations you want. But the whole point is that it's a one-liner to add everything. Now, if you're obviously you need to call the UI, so you need to add that into your controllers. Whether you're working with Blazor, Razor, MVC, and Web APIs, they all support the same libraries, and they all support the new library. So you're good to go. And then you need to make sure that you call the authentication or use authentication here. Then inside your controllers, you just do the authorize or you force authentication across the board. This is a one-liner. If you are calling an API, then you just have to say, you know what, I want to enable token acquisition here. And then because you're calling another API, you want to have a cache. So out of the box, you have in-memory caches, you have distributed caches, and you have session caches. So they're all out there for you. This is it. A one-liner. You don't have to have any in-depth knowledge about OpenIDC Connect. You don't have to worry about endpoints or anything else. Next, I want to jump to an API. Again, in a very similar manner, you have your app settings in your API. Well, let me make it slightly bigger so everybody can see this. I haven't configured my API settings here. That is, it's fine. But if I jump into my startup, it's the same expectation. The configuration should include an Azure AD section. Then it's a one-liner. So we say add Microsoft.Identity.Web API authentication, and that will do all the token validation and make sure that you have the appropriate information in your tokens. And then if you jump into a controller, then again, the authorization is a one-liner. So if you ever done any token management in the past, or you had to check scopes, you know that you had to roll out your own code to look into the token and make sure they had the right scopes. So here, all I did is add the authorize attribute, which is the consistent one, or the one that has been brought back from .NET Core. And then check this out. In HTTP context, we actually have a call that calls the verify user has accepted scopes. And then you pass the scopes in here, and that does the whole job. So if the token comes in and they don't have the appropriate scopes for the API, then they get bounced back. So again, with 3 lines of code, I was able to implement some very complex logic that is hidden behind behind the library. So we abstracted a lot of stuff, and people are loving it so much now that they're asking for the same library or the same wrapper around the MSAL and the authentication to be available for other languages like PHP, Node, Java, and what have you. And that's the end of my demo because I think I want to finish here with the highlight, which is so very few lines of code to achieve so much.
Thank you, Christos. So that was looking at a net new app. I'm going to look at an older app, and by older, I guess in .NET Core terms, that means 5 months ago or 6 months ago. But this application is one that fairly verbose. So a lot of the configuration I had to do on my own. And if we look at this configure services, it may be fairly familiar, especially if you've had to do OpenID Connect or do any Azure AD app work on your own. So we have all the configuration that happens here. Of course, all this is coming out of configuration on our own. And then we have to add a cookie, and that cookie comes back. But then we have to go and configure our events, right? So in our events and our authorization code received event, for example, this is when we're creating our new MSAL objects, and these new MSAL objects are what's happening to handle the authorization code swap and then caching that token so that we can go back and use it later on in a controller action, for example. So we've got a couple other events. We're not doing anything with these right now, but we've got 70, 80 lines of code that we've got to have here just to get this configured. And of course, if we switch to the other branch where we've moved this to Identity.Web, this is the extent of it, right? So now we're configuring our app here with this. We need to enable token acquisition to call a downstream API, and we want to add a cache. So I'll use an in-memory cache for this one, and now we're done. And we can go back through and delete all of this code that we had for configuring all these extra services and cut out nearly 100 lines of code and get to what is essentially an identical level of functionality, right? The best part about this demo is it doesn't really take much because all we're doing is deleting code. Of course, anytime we can delete code, that's a good day. But so we managed to take a significant amount of code that requires a significant amount of sort of specific knowledge around how the flows work of, well, what is an authorization code flow and how does that work? And then what does it mean to say, redeem that authorization code? And then how do I cache a token securely? Where do I put it? Or how do I interact with the MSAL token cache, which of course is much better than it was historically, but it's still yet another detail that someone would have to know. And if you're new to the platform or if you've got other work to do, it's an extra work that you just don't want to have to do. So we're super excited about this coming out. We also, Christos and I have worked on doing this with Blazor. And so we've managed to get this working with Blazor server side, and Blazor client side is a little bit different because there's sort of a higher level wrapper that goes around the whole thing. But this absolutely works in Blazor server side, and will be a part of the templates later on, closer to release. So that is sort of the net what we wanted to look at today. Are there any sort of questions, concerns before we move on?
I have been answering quite a few questions from the chat, but maybe we can bring some here. Someone's asking whether it supports Azure AD B2C on behalf of Flow.
So OBO support itself in B2C is the larger question. So I would say when B2C supports OBO properly and thoroughly, and it's announced that's supported, this library will handle it. So one of the things one of the sort of focuses of this library was specifically that you could switch between Azure AD and B2C with minimal code change. It is as minimal as a configuration change. The code itself doesn't actually have to change. If you were to add a B2C authority and to add a B2C flow for a sign-in or sign-up flow, once those are added into the configuration, the library handles sort of toggling over to use B2C.
Yeah. Next question from Jamie: can OpenID Connect events be extended with our own logic? Yes, they can. If you look into the documentation, they have ways for you to tap into the extended configuration.
That's right. They can be. There are specific event hooks that are available in the Identity.Web web app authentication. There are specific hooks there for including your own OpenID Connect events.
Yeah. One question again, and that's a very important question by Nair. Is it possible to use this library on legacy .NET Framework 4.7 apps? Do you want to answer that, or do you want to answer that?
As of right now, it's .NET Core 3.1 and up. Is it 3.1 yes. or 2?
No, 3.1 and later. I don't think there's plans for backporting the library. Sorry for being the messengers of bad news, but the whole point is to make it easier going forward. And I feel your pain. I totally feel your pain. But yeah, sorry, no support for. I wouldn't call it legacy, but I would say the old .NET framework is not supported. Sorry for that. Next question, is there any chance for a version for .NET Framework 4.8? Again, sorry, no.
We will make sure that that
Feedback
is captured and bubbled, because we certainly you are not the first you are not the first group that's asked for that. So we will make sure that is well known.
Correct. Somebody else has asked, how does this fit into the Microsoft Identity Platform? I already answered that in the chat, but for people that are not monitoring the chat, I would say it actually sits on top of MSAL. So it's not a new functionality. It's not, it's not something new or a new version of the authentication. We just abstracted the pain of user sign-in and token management and made it super easy. But you can still use the existing MSAL libraries if you still want to roll that way. Totally up to you.
Yep, that's it's intended to be a new API to abstract all of the complexity away, because there is so much complexity, but none of the underlying functionality itself is changing. It's all still there, and of course you're welcome to use it. You don't have to use Identity.Web. All of that underlying code is still there to use if you have those kinds of requirements where you still need to use it.
Yeah. Two more questions. One is, does it support hybrid models where you have to authenticate against Azure AD and on-prem AD?
So
deep breath. You can do
this. I'm mostly thinking of the mechanism you'd have to use in order to do that. So I don't believe it supports an ADFS authority. So if you were using ADFS locally, ADFS would essentially be a separate OpenID provider. If the question is between something like Kerberos, like a straight up Kerberos, no, this library would have nothing to do with interacting with Kerberos at all, because that would be primarily like an IIS side setting to effectively enable Kerberos. There may be some ways to use authentication policies or authorization policies to require certain to protect certain parts of an app in different ways. So we've done that before with, say, an app that needed to use Azure AD and B2C, for example. But no, there's no sort of hybrid expectation out of the box if it's direct Kerberos. And if you were doing it with ADFS to get OpenID on-prem, you'd have to set it up as a separate provider.
Yeah. And people are loving the library so much that now are asking, how is it easy to connect with other external identity providers? And I will take this one. Unfortunately, we do not support other identity providers for now. If you feel that this is a library that should be extended to, to work with other providers, then please make sure that you let us know. But remember, it's built on top of MSAL, right? So for now, it is designed to work with Azure AD and B2C. So that's the limitation here. However, it does support working with third-party APIs. So I did mention before that we make it super easy to acquire access tokens for, say, things like Graph or things like internal APIs. Now we add the functionality to allow you to call any other API without really having to, like, it's built into the library. So that's a major win there, because it becomes very easy to call other APIs by injecting them. Another question, has it built-in functionality for generating step-up consent URLs and middleware handles for intercepting callbacks and handling updated consents?
What it handles is, so it doesn't do this in Blazor. There are incremental and dynamic consent methods for in token acquisition. So if you start the app with 2 scopes and you need an additional scope later on, the library will handle that. So there's a mechanism there to pass in the scopes that you need, just kind of how you would do it with MSAL, as you say which scopes that you need, and then really most of the work is delegated down to MSAL, and MSAL goes and generates a redirect to send a user over to do their new consents, and then comes back with that access token that reflects that.
Yeah, I don't know if that answers Donald's question with regards to the middleware handlers. I don't know if you specifically need to do something when those calls are intercepted, but we definitely know, and we have tested the incremental consent, which is built into MSAL and V2 endpoints. So there's that. The next question is for the ones that support OIDC, and I suspect that this refers to identity providers. it should be easy. That's from John, who says that right now we're focusing on integrating with Azure AD, but we might be able to support OpenID Connect providers, other OpenID providers in the future. Next question, are there any use cases, and shout out to my Greek buddy over there, are there any use cases where it is recommended to use MSAL instead of this library? I would probably say it's recommended to use this library over MSAL because it makes your life so much easier, but you can still acquire the token and pass it manually to an MSAL library if you want to. I don't see why you wouldn't do that, but
there may be cases, if there may be specific configurations or specific levels of control where you would want to use this over MSAL, but the token acquisition part is sort of largely abstracted away from you. So if you need low-level MSAL access, if you have very specific sort of cache before access and after accesses that you want to manipulate on your own, or if you've implemented an entire iToken cache on your own, you may want to consider waiting a little bit. There's still some API changes going on. It's not 100% locked yet, and the accessibility of the MSAL object itself is still a little bit of a question mark. So I would say if you're just doing authentication and authorization to access to acquire tokens, it would be a good place to start. If you are really heavily manipulating the MSAL object, I would certainly take pause and examine exactly what you're doing before jumping into this. But then also let us know what scenarios you have, if those are up, of areas where you find the library won't work.
I don't think we have anything else. We covered most of the questions out there.
Okay, great. And so lastly, twice a week, Christos and I do this, where we build stuff with Identity.Web, or we build stuff with MSAL browser for React or for Angular apps. And so we'd love to have you come and join us. It's at 7 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Eastern, every Tuesday and Thursday at the link that's up there on your screen, and we'd love to have you. So, and here's a whole sort of collection of links related to the rest of the M365 developer community. And then I believe Stephen has a survey for you to take as well as to how relevant or helpful this was. And of course, feel free to reach out to us with any questions or concerns as they come up. Stephen?
Yes, thank you, John Patrick and Christos. So if you can take a few minutes to fill it out and just let us know what you thought of the call, or if you have any suggestions for topics that we can cover in future calls, that will be great. But otherwise, if you have any additional questions, feel free to ask them. I think we still have time to answer a few questions.
Yeah, there was one about working with Graph. So it's like, how do you use the token you cast with the Graph? You don't have to worry about that. In fact, 0.4 release, the latest one, added support for adding Graph as a dependency or registering Graph as a service into your service containers. And there's a NuGet package called Microsoft.Identity.Web.Microsoft Graph. And with that, you can call Graph directly from your controllers without really having to worry about token acquisition or passing tokens or what have you. Once you acquire your scopes, then you're good to go. So it's pretty cool. And that was based on feedback that we got from internal teams and people that have started using it. So it's great to see that.
There's a token acquisition. There's a token acquisition interface that you can inject as well into your controllers or into your into any sort of downstream classes. So once they're added to the container by virtue of all the config up front, it was in 0.3 called iToken acquisition. I'm not sure if the name has changed for 0.4, but it's an interface that you can inject. So take a dependency on the interface and in your controllers, and you can get tokens that way for whatever scopes you need.
Yeah. How soon will it appear or made available for production apps? On the 29th of this month, we're hosting Jean-Marc, the principal PM that has worked on this library. Make sure to tune on our show and ask all these questions. I know that we're heading to GA very, very fast. We're ironing out any issues with the API. So we want to make sure that when this lands, there are not major changes, because I don't know if any of you has been following the library, but there's been some significant changes to the way that we declare service registration and use it. So I'm not going to commit to any time frames, but John Mark will have more information on the 29th. So make sure on the 29th, join the 45 show and hit us with all the questions. Silence. Right. Yeah. People are either really impressed by that or run out of questions. It's definitely a pleasure to come and explain how the new identity world is going to work in 3.1 and 5.0 ASP.NET. So
yeah, I think anyone who's had to build with it as it is today, I think will absolutely appreciate the changes that are in Identity.Web, and for new users who have never used any of it before, it's an extremely short and quick on ramp to get the 80% of cases out of the box. And the question that just popped up in the chat, the token cache. So we out of the box, it'll support an iDistributed cache. So if you configure an iDistributed cache for ASP.NET Core overall, you can use that distributed cache with MSAL. In fact, we built one with Cosmos just a few weeks ago to use Cosmos DB as one.
Yeah.
The only out-of-the-box default ones that we have today, I believe, are the in-memory one, and so just for dev and test. There was a SQL one, but I don't believe that one's still there. I think
it's still there. So all right. So there is an add in-memory caches. There is an add session token caches for session management, and then there's distributed token caches that support Ncas, Redis, distributed memory, Azure Cosmos DB, and SQL Server. So anything that actually implements the distributed memory cache API can be used. So if you have your own custom distributed memory cache that you rolled out in your solution, it can be added straight into our API. So it's plug and play.
Yep. It just uses the distributed cache infrastructure in ASP.NET Core instead of having a completely separate implementation that has to be managed separately. So, yep.
Exactly. And it's a one-liner. So again, we made it as easy as possible for you lot to work with it.
Very cool.
Mm-hmm. More code gone. Exactly.
Yep. Hey, a day you delete code is a good day, right? I'm all for that. Well, thanks for having us, Stephen. We really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll talk to your audience soon. And if there are any questions, feel free to forward them on.
Yeah, thank you guys, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We're gonna give you a few minutes back in the hour, but thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. See ya.